In the early 1960s, the United States government faced a rapidly changing social landscape. Civil rights movements were gaining momentum. Cold War tensions shaped domestic policy, and questions of authority, dissent, and national stability were at the center of public debate. Within this environment, one figure drew sustained attention from federal institutions, not because he held public office, but because his voice reached millions. That figure was Malcolm X. Malcolm X did not command an army, control a political party, or represent a foreign government. Yet his influence, clarity of speech, and ability to mobilize public attention placed him firmly within the view of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies. To understand why, it is necessary to examine the nature of his early public role and the historical context in which he emerged. By the late 1950s, Malcolm X had become the most prominent spokesman for the Nation of Islam, an organization that combined religious teaching with social discipline and racial self-determination. At a time when many Black Americans felt excluded from mainstream civil rights leadership, Malcolm articulated a message that emphasized self-respect, moral reform, and independence from institutions that had historically denied equality. His speeches were direct, structured, and uncompromising in tone. He criticized systemic racism and questioned whether existing political structures were capable of delivering justice. Importantly, Malcolm framed these critiques in public forums, churches, universities, televised interviews, where his words reached audiences far beyond the Nation of Islam itself. This visibility mattered. From the perspective of federal authorities, the early 1960s were marked by heightened concern about domestic stability. The government closely monitored organizations and individuals it believed could influence large groups of people, particularly during a period when social unrest and ideological conflict were prominent. Malcolm X fit several criteria that attracted attention. He was highly articulate. He commanded loyalty among followers. He rejected traditional integrationist frameworks, and he openly criticized U.S. institutions. None of these actions were illegal. However, they placed Malcolm within a category of public figures whose influence warranted observation under existing federal practices of the time. Historical records confirm that Malcolm X was subject to surveillance by multiple government agencies. These efforts were part of broader monitoring programs directed at civil rights leaders, religious movements, and political activists across the ideological spectrum. The purpose of such surveillance was not uniform. In some cases, agencies sought to understand organizational structure. In others, they aimed to assess potential threats to public order. What is clear is that Malcolm's speeches and travels were systematically documented. This scrutiny reflected not fear in the emotional sense, but institutional concern over influence and reach. Malcolm was aware that he was being watched. He spoke publicly about surveillance as a reality faced by many outspoken figures of his era. Rather than moderating his message, he responded by refining it. His speeches became more precise. His language became more deliberate. He avoided spontaneous remarks that could be easily misrepresented. This discipline was intentional. Malcolm understood that power did not only reside in institutions, it also resided in narrative. He recognized that his words could shape public perception, and he treated that responsibility with care. Unlike some contemporaries, Malcolm did not position himself as a revolutionary leader seeking to overthrow government authority. Instead, he framed his critiques within historical analysis and moral argument. He challenged contradictions between democratic ideals and lived realities, particularly for Black Americans. This distinction is important. The government's attention was not rooted in accusations of criminal activity, but in Malcolm's ability to influence thought. He spoke to audiences that felt unheard. He articulated grievances that were widely felt but rarely addressed so directly. Influence in this context was a central issue. Media coverage amplified this effect. Television interviews and newspaper features brought Malcolm X into American living rooms. His calm delivery contrasted with the intensity of his critique. For supporters, this combination made him credible. For critics, it made him unsettling. Federal agencies tracked his growing reach carefully, documenting not only what Malcolm said, but where he said it and who attended his events. These records now serve as historical evidence of how seriously the government took his presence. At this stage in his life, Malcolm X was still operating within the framework of the Nation of Islam. His views were shaped by its doctrines, and his authority derived from his role as spokesman. Yet even then, his independence of thought was visible. He studied history extensively. He read legal texts, global news, and philosophical works. His critiques were not improvised, they were constructed. This intellectual rigor distinguished him from caricatures often presented in popular memory. By the early 1960s, monitoring Malcolm X was no longer incidental. It had become systematic. This shift did not occur because Malcolm had committed a crime or called for violence. It occurred because federal authorities increasingly understood him as a communicator whose reach extended across geography, media, and ideology. In an era defined by Cold War anxieties and domestic unrest, the U.S. government devoted significant resources to understanding how influence traveled and who wielded it most effectively. Malcolm X was now firmly within that category. Government surveillance of public figures during this period followed established procedures. Agencies tracked speeches, travel itineraries, organizational affiliations, and media appearances. These practices were applied broadly to labor leaders, civil rights organizers, religious movements, and political activists. Malcolm X's file grew for a straightforward reason. He was active, visible, and influential. He spoke frequently. He traveled extensively. He attracted press attention wherever he went. From the government's perspective, these factors required documentation. Records later released show that Malcolm's speeches were routinely summarized. His statements were not only noted but contextualized. Who attended, what topics he emphasized, and how audiences responded. Travel between cities was logged. Meetings with international visitors were noted. This level of detail reflected concern about networks, not personality. Authorities sought to understand how ideas moved through communities, and whether those ideas could contribute to unrest or foreign influence during a tense geopolitical moment. Malcolm's critiques of U.S. racial policy, when heard abroad, intersected uncomfortably with Cold War narratives about American democracy. That intersection mattered. Malcolm understood this dynamic clearly in public statements. He acknowledged that criticism of domestic injustice could be used by foreign governments to question U.S. moral authority. Rather than retreat, he argued that addressing injustice strengthened democracy rather than weakened it. This argument did not reduce surveillance. If anything, it increased institutional attention. Malcolm was now engaging issues of international perception, a realm the federal government took seriously. The presence of surveillance also shaped Malcolm's behavior. Contrary to popular myth, he did not respond with secrecy or provocation. He responded with structure. He planned speeches carefully. He avoided ambiguous language. He documented his own movements. Colleagues later recalled that Malcolm was methodical about public appearances, aware that misinterpretation could have consequences not just for himself, but for those associated with him. This discipline reflected experience, not paranoia. Media appearances amplified this effect. Television interviews brought Malcolm into direct dialogue with journalists and critics. He spoke calmly, often correcting misconceptions about his views. While his positions challenged mainstream narratives, his delivery remained controlled and analytical. From a surveillance standpoint, these interviews were valuable data points. They demonstrated how Malcolm adapted his message to broader audiences and how effectively he could articulate complex critiques within limited time frames. Influence was measurable. Within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm's growing visibility had mixed effects. On one hand, It expanded the organization's public profile. On the other, it concentrated attention on a single figure, something that increased both internal tension and external scrutiny. Federal observers noted this concentration carefully. Organizations built around charismatic spokespeople were often seen as vulnerable to rapid change, either escalation or fragmentation. Malcolm's prominence raised questions not only about his ideas, but about what might happen if his role shifted. That possibility was being quietly evaluated. Surveillance did not mean constant physical monitoring. Much of it involved collecting publicly available information, news articles, speeches, radio broadcasts. However, the cumulative effect was significant. Malcolm X became one of the most documented figures of the civil rights era. This documentation now provides historians with a clearer picture of how seriously his influence was regarded, not just by supporters and critics, but by institutions tasked with maintaining national stability. It is important to note what the records do not show. They do not show evidence that Malcolm planned violence. They do not show evidence of coordination with foreign governments. They do not show criminal intent. What they show instead is concern about ideas, how they spread, how they resonated, and how they might challenge prevailing narratives during a volatile period. As surveillance intensified, Malcolm's own thinking continued to evolve. He began to question whether remaining within a single organization limited his ability to address the full scope of racial injustice. He became increasingly interested in framing the Black American experience within international human rights discourse, a move that would soon redefine his role entirely. From the government perspective, this shift carried implications. An individual who spoke domestically was one thing. An individual who connected domestic inequality to global systems was another. By early 1964, the nature of government attention toward Malcolm X began to change, not in volume alone, but in focus. For more than a decade, federal agencies had monitored Malcolm primarily as a spokesman operating within a defined organizational structure. His authority, influence, and message were understood as extensions of the Nation of Islam. That framework, while unconventional, was stable and predictable. What altered institutional calculations was not simply Malcolm's departure from a Nation of Islam, but what followed immediately after. Independence transformed observation into heightened concern. When Malcolm publicly announced his separation from a Nation of Islam in March 1964, he removed a layer of predictability that institutions rely upon when assessing influence. He was no longer bound by a centralized leadership, internal rules, or a closed doctrine. He was now acting as an individual, self-directed, globally mobile, and intellectually evolving in real time. From a government perspective, this mattered. Individuals operating outside formal hierarchies are more difficult to categorize, anticipate, and contain. Malcolm's independence did not make him more radical, but it made him less legible to institutions accustomed to organizational analysis. The shift became unmistakable during Malcolm's international travels. In April 1964, Malcolm undertook the pilgrimage to Mecca, followed by extensive travel across Africa and the Middle East. These journeys placed him in direct contact with diplomats, heads of state, and leaders of newly independent nations. For federal agencies, international engagement raised new questions, not about allegiance, but about perception. At the height of the Cold War, how the United States was portrayed abroad carried strategic significance. Malcolm's critiques of American racial inequality, when voiced on international platforms, intersected with concerns about global reputation. This did not make Malcolm an enemy of the state, but it did elevate institutional sensitivity. Government records from this period show increased attention to Malcolm's travel patterns, public statements overseas, and meetings with foreign officials. The focus was informational rather than accusatory. Agencies sought to understand context, audience, and impact. What Malcolm said mattered less than where it was heard. Malcolm understood this reality clearly. Rather than softening his critique, he reframed it. He began to describe racial injustice in the United States not solely as a civil rights issue, but as a human rights concern, one that could be addressed within international legal and diplomatic frameworks. This reframing was deliberate. Human rights discourse transcended national boundaries. It invited global scrutiny, and it positioned African American struggles within a broader conversation about post-colonial justice and self-determination. For institutions tasked with managing domestic stability and foreign perception, this represented a meaningful shift. Upon returning to the United States, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The organization's stated goals were political education, economic development, and international cooperation. It was secular, inclusive, and explicitly engaged with civic participation. From a surveillance standpoint, the OAU differed sharply from Malcolm's previous affiliations. It encouraged voting rather than abstention. It sought alliances rather than separation, and it framed advocacy in legal and institutional terms. Paradoxically, these changes did not reduce attention. They increased analytical interest. Why? Because Malcolm's influence was no longer confined to a defined religious movement. His message now intersected with mainstream political processes, international law, and global public opinion. He had become a bridge figure, connecting domestic racial grievances with international norms. Bridges are watched carefully. Malcolm's public speeches during this period reflected a noticeable shift in tone. He spoke with greater nuance, emphasizing education, accountability, and coalition building. While he remained critical of systemic racism, he avoided absolutist language. This moderation did not signal retreat. It signaled strategy. Observers, both supportive and skeptical, recognized that Malcolm was expanding his audience. University invitations increased. International media coverage grew. His voice reached beyond traditional activist circles. Influence, once again, was the central concern. Government agencies adjusted accordingly. Monitoring now emphasized international contacts, organizational development, and public reception. Analysts assessed whether Malcolm's evolving message would resonate across racial and political lines. They tracked how his ideas were reported abroad and discussed domestically. Importantly, this scrutiny remained within the bounds of existing federal practices of the era. It reflected institutional caution rather than exceptional treatment. Malcolm was not alone in this regard, but he was distinctive in his trajectory. At the same time, Malcolm faced growing personal vulnerability. Independence brought freedom of thought, but it removed institutional buffers. Without the Nation of Islam's structure, he relied on personal discipline and limited organizational support. He was aware that visibility carried risk, and he spoke openly about the responsibilities that came with leadership. Despite these challenges, Malcolm did not retreat. He believed that clarity, intellectual and moral, was essential to progress. He accepted that growth involved uncertainty and that influence invited scrutiny. This acceptance shaped his final year. By late 1964, Malcolm X occupied a uniquely exposed position in American public life. He was no longer shielded by a large organization, yet he remained one of the most recognizable and influential voices on race, power, and justice in the country. This combination, visibility without institutional protection, defined the final phase of his public work. For federal authorities, Malcolm had become more difficult to assess. He was not operating within the predictable boundaries of a single movement. His alliances were fluid. His ideas were evolving. His reach extended from local community halls to international audiences. Observation continued, but so did uncertainty. Malcolm's daily life reflected this tension. He traveled frequently, often with minimal security. He spoke at universities, churches, and community centers, addressing audiences that were increasingly diverse in age, race, and political orientation. His lectures emphasized political education, civic participation, and international awareness. The tone was measured, but the substance remained challenging. He argued that inequality persisted not because of individual prejudice alone, but because of institutional structures. He encouraged listeners to study law, history, and economics, not simply protest. This emphasis on knowledge as power marked a clear departure from earlier absolutist rhetoric. It also expanded his appeal. From a government perspective, this expansion mattered. Malcolm's ideas were now circulating in spaces traditionally associated with mainstream discourse. His presence on college campuses and in international forums suggested a growing legitimacy that extended beyond activist circles. Monitoring reflected this shift. Analysts focused less on Malcolm's affiliations and more on his audience. Who was listening? How were his ideas being interpreted? Could his framing of human rights influence public debate beyond civil rights legislation? These questions shaped institutional attention during his final months. At the same time, Malcolm faced increasing isolation. Traditional civil rights leaders remained cautious, uncertain how to reconcile his past rhetoric with his present evolution. Former associates within the Nation of Islam viewed his independence with hostility. Media narratives often lagged behind his intellectual growth, continuing to frame him through outdated stereotypes. This isolation was not merely social, it was structural. Malcolm lacked the resources, staff, and security that larger organizations could provide. His work depended heavily on personal discipline and limited support networks. Despite this, he continued to speak openly, believing that retreat would undermine the principles he now championed. Government surveillance during this period remained largely informational. Records indicate continued documentation of speeches, travel, and public appearances. There is no credible evidence that Malcolm was treated as a criminal suspect. Instead, he was regarded as a high-impact communicator whose independence made outcomes less predictable. This distinction is critical. The concern was not about imminent threat. It was about influence during a period of rapid social change. Malcolm was aware of the risks. He spoke privately about the strain of constant scrutiny and public misunderstanding. He expressed concern for his family's safety and took modest precautions when possible. Yet he resisted the idea that fear should dictate public engagement. In speeches, he emphasized that progress required courage tempered by responsibility. He warned against internal divisions that weakened collective efforts. He encouraged critical thinking rather than blind allegiance. These themes reflected a leader focused on long-term outcomes rather than short-term attention. As pressure mounted, Malcolm's message continued to mature. He spoke increasingly about unity across differences, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity. He acknowledged that lasting change required cooperation among diverse groups, even when perspectives differed. This emphasis marked one of the most significant shifts in his thinking. It also complicated existing narratives about him. On February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was scheduled to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. The event was organized by the Organization of Afro-American Unity and was intended as a routine address. What occurred that afternoon is documented extensively in historical records. Malcolm X was assassinated during the event. The loss was immediate and far-reaching. Reactions to Malcolm's death reflected the divisions that had followed him throughout his life. International leaders, human rights advocates, and scholars recognized the significance of his final work. Within the United States, responses ranged from mourning to misunderstanding, shaped by years of conflicting portrayals. For government institutions, the event marked the end of surveillance, but not of historical relevance. Malcolm's ideas did not disappear with him. When surveillance ends, influence does not. In the months following the assassination of Malcolm X, U.S. government monitoring of his activities ceased entirely. Files were closed. Reports stopped accumulating. observations ended. Yet Malcolm X's power did not. This final chapter examines what surveillance ultimately failed to contain: the enduring impact of ideas grounded in intellectual discipline, moral evolution, and historical clarity. During his lifetime, Malcolm X was watched because institutions recognized their capacity to shape perception. He spoke to people who felt excluded from political processes. He articulated contradictions between democratic ideals and lived realities, and he did so with clarity that resisted simplification. What government agencies monitored was not a man preparing rebellion, but a thinker refining language. That distinction matters. Malcolm's power did not come from formal authority. He held no elected office. He commanded no military force. He led no mass political party. Instead, his influence emerged from three interlocking qualities: credibility, adaptability, and global awareness. Credibility came from lived experience. Malcolm spoke about inequality not as an abstraction, but as a reality he had navigated personally. This gave his arguments weight, even among those who disagreed with him. Adaptability came from his willingness to change. Malcolm's evolution from Nation of Islam spokesman to independent human rights advocate demonstrated intellectual integrity. Rather than rigidly defending earlier positions, he revised them publicly as new evidence and experiences emerged. Global awareness came from perspective. By situating African American struggles within international human rights discourse, Malcolm reframed domestic inequality as part of a worldwide pattern. This reframing extended his relevance far beyond U.S. borders. These qualities explain why surveillance followed him and why it ultimately proved insufficient. After his death, Malcolm X's speeches, interviews, and writings continued to circulate widely. Universities added his work to curricula. Scholars examined his transformation as a case study in political development. Activists across continents cited his later ideas on dignity, accountability, and coalition building. Importantly, Malcolm was no longer being interpreted solely through the lens of conflict. Historical distance allowed for reassessment. Researchers began to emphasize the full arc of his life rather than isolated moments. His early absolutism was contextualized within the racial climate of mid-century America. His later moderation was understood not as retreat, but as maturation. This reassessment reshaped his legacy. From an institutional perspective, Malcolm X represents a lesson in the limits of surveillance. Monitoring can document behavior. It can map networks. It can track movement. What it cannot do is halt the long-term circulation of ideas that resonate because they address real conditions. Malcolm's critiques endured because the inequalities he described did not vanish with him. Today, Malcolm X is studied globally, not as a symbol of fear, but as an example of intellectual courage. His life demonstrates that principled evolution is not instability, but strength. That critique does not weaken democratic ideals. It tests them. This reframing is particularly relevant for global audiences in the UK, Europe, and beyond, where Malcolm is increasingly understood as part of a broader tradition of anti-colonial thought and human rights advocacy. He is no longer viewed only as an American figure. He is understood as a global one. Malcolm's final legacy is not defined by the fact that the U.S. government watched him. It is defined by why it did. He challenged narratives at a time when narrative control mattered deeply. He exposed inconsistencies without relying on spectacle. He insisted that moral authority required honesty, even when honesty carried personal cost. Surveillance followed influence. Influence followed clarity, and clarity outlived surveillance. In examining Malcolm X through this lens, history offers a sober conclusion. The state did not fear Malcolm X because he sought chaos. It watched him because he produced coherence in a fragmented moment. That coherence, rooted in education, self-respect, and evolving thought, remains his most powerful contribution. Malcolm X did not live to complete his intellectual journey. But what he left behind was not unfinished ideology. It was a method. Question rigorously, study widely, evolve publicly, and speak with discipline. That method continues to shape conversations long after the files were closed.